Okay, hey everybody, welcome to another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today we have another fun review for you from the brand BOLDR Supply Company. Now, they're based out of Singapore and Malaysia, and they manufacture watches and gear that are super tough, stylish, yet functional, and always ready for adventure. Now, this particular type of watch, I'd consider it an everyday adventure watch. And when you're looking for something that'll be capable enough to go with you along your everyday adventure, of course, you're going to want that balance of sporty, legible, and tough attributes. Now, this particular model is actually a reissue. It's their Expedition 1, and this is the Karakum colorway, which is the black dial, and it's actually been fitted to the optional stainless steel bracelet, which is new, and I'm really excited about that to share with you guys. The Expedition 2 has been featured on the channel. It's part of the permanent collection. But this is actually the watch that kind of started all of BOLDR's momentum. So in terms of how popular they've become, a lot of it was set forth by this watch. So it was definitely very interesting to see this actually be discontinued, only to be brought back later on, kind of due to popular demand. Now, this is actually named after Turkmenistani's famed Karakum Desert, home of the Davarzan crater or the gates of hell. Now, the Karakum Desert is known by Karakum or black sand, and it occupies around 70% of Turkmenistan. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. Feel free to correct me down in the comments below. Each model is serialized from 1 to 300, and it is limited to 300 pieces. You can get these for $6.99 direct, and they do come typically on a canvas strap, but you can see here I am actually featuring on the stainless steel bracelet, which you can get for about 140 bucks separately, or 139. So with all that said, let's go ahead, zoom the camera out, get this piece in hand, and take a closer look. All right, guys, now before we pick it up, a quick little EDC check. I wanted to feature it with this really great sprint run from Urban Survival Gear. This is their, ooh, yes, the smoothness. Definitely keep an eye out. Although this particular pen is no longer available because it was a limited sprint run, I am looking forward to sharing it with you guys, so you can keep an eye out for other limited sprint runs just like this. It is absolutely gorgeous. Urban Survival Gear, definitely search them on YouTube, search them in my channel, and you'll see some of their great work. Also, very EDC related with the Adventure Watch, of course, a very popular knife. This is the Benchmade Bug Out. This is actually a custom done M4 model with the coating and then applied weapons technology. Wonderful scales here. They are nicely milled and gorgeously decorated there with the great coating. These are actually made out of aluminum, so very, very lightweight. And yeah, this thing is pretty fantastic, and I did like how the terrain lines tied into some of the themes here of this particular timepiece. So let's check them out. Now, let's cover the specs a little bit here. This is a 41mm diameter watch with a 14mm thickness and a 48mm lug to lug. It's made out of 316L stainless steel that's been matte blasted in finish. It does have a sapphire double dome crystal with inner AR, and you can see that that AR coating does a great job, even of course if it's reflecting right off the studio lights, but you can see that it has that bit of a tint to it, and it just helps that dial read extremely clear and legible. Let me give it a quick wipe here off screen. All right. Whew. So some of you are like, oh, Expedition 1, what's the Expedition 2 look like? Well, here you go. Here's kind of what it evolved to, which is going to have a lot more of BOLDR's current design language and DNA. Very angular, very chiseled, ultimately very, very nice. But some folks really did enjoy this very classic take, and you can see really even the bracelet tells a story. Everything's more rounded. versus being very angular and faceted. But in terms of quality, definitely very similar. I'd say this BOLDR is very reminiscent of something you might see from, let's say, a German-made brand, where it's very minimalist, but also extremely functional. Whereas the BOLDR definitely has a more modern style to it there. And ultimately has kind of a more futuristic and more overbuilt tone, where here you're going to, of course, this is still quite overbuilt, but I think it's just a little bit more subdued in its style and its theme execution, but ultimately still quite capable, very similar in capability. The main difference being you have a display case back here with those terrain lines, as you can see, versus a solid case back that's been engraved, which also kind of hides some anti-magnetic features that you will get in the Expedition 2. So now that you've kind of seen these two, let's just dig into the details here. So you do have that very nice internal rotating compass bezel, and it's internally rotating, and it's basically screw down crown here, very nicely knurled in terms of the quality, very beautiful as well. So nice tactile engagement there, while also being really quite handsome. So that's a double win for me, and it is bi-directional, if I forgot to mention that. Now the crown is screw down and signed very nicely. As you can see, it's kind of the only part that is polished on here is going to be that little face of the crown. Everything else is going to be matte blasted, excuse me, and I think it looks really great that way. Inside, you're going to have your Swiss automatic Sellita SW200-1, which isn't decorated to any high amount or anything like that, so you won't find blued screws or any perlage, but I think that fits with the theme really well from that perspective. Now, in terms of this dial, it is pretty straightforward, matte black, printed indices. You do have these nice matte gray hands which tie into the case and bracelet finishing, and you get that date at the 4 o'clock. And then, yeah, you're getting Swiss Superluminova BGW9 and C3, so looking forward to showing you guys a closer look when it comes to Lume Shots on this particular piece. The water resistance, although they did add these, they do have a see-through case back and everything, it still is 200 meters of water resistance capable, which is great. So 20 atmospheres or 20 ATM and 200 meters, very, very nice. This bracelet has a 20 millimeter lug width on the watch, so it tapers from 20 millimeters down to 18. 3-link, fully articulated, so this isn't three pieces that are kind of stuck together. They all articulate, as you can see, so it's going to drape just gorgeously on your wrist. I mean, honestly, some watches have half links that are around this size. So with the sizing here, essentially where they're all half links, it really helps you dial it in. Plus, you do have, of course, these great manual micro adjust holes. Not the most modern, but definitely does the job. And for something like this, it feels very simple and it feels very purpose built. So you don't necessarily need all the bells and whistles and tricks you might get from some fancy, let's say, divers style clasp. So this does the job, keeps it clean. It's kind of like a knife in that easy to break down, easy to clean, easy to service and maintenance in terms of the overall design functionality in the way that the bracelet works. Also to mention, if you didn't notice, screw pin connectors, which is great and people love that. And then of course fully milled in terms of the clasp, then the folding section, and even the little V here. So very nice, but let's go ahead and get this piece on wrist and see how it wears. All right, guys, as you can see on my 7¼ wrist, wears really, really well. Even if I get up close here, where there's gonna be some lens distortion and make the watch seem a little bit larger than it really is, you can see it is still quite centered on my 7¼ wrist. And I am wearing it a little bit higher above the wrist bone, so probably even maybe closer to 7½, somewhere in between there. So really beautifully done. You can see with a little bit more of my arm and hand in there, it's something where it's not a super huge watch. It's a 41 millimeter, and the dial real estate is, I think, really, really well balanced. Of course, you do have a very thin kind of outer fixed bezel here, but that inner rotating bezel, I think it does help kind of distribute the line weights of all of the information that's on there. Plus, you do have those classic crosshairs, which some might find a little confusing at a glance in terms of telling the time. But for me, I think with these syringe style hands, and then of course that nice pop of orange on the sweeping seconds hand, it really is hard to get that confused. And I feel like the crosshairs do help in terms of just very quickly referencing time by having the dial kind of cut into 4 different quadrants. You can see that it lays on the wrist really nicely. Check that out. The lugs turn down very nicely there. Everything's nice and round, very organic feeling, and it really suits the font that's on there as well, versus the newer version, which is great and I love. It's more of a juxtaposition where you have a very rounded, bold text with more of a squared off look in terms of the aesthetic of the case design, where here everything kind of flows together just a bit more organically, and I think that's a good thing. It ultimately, for me, does make it a little bit more versatile, but on the downside, it makes it a little bit more plain. So this is definitely something where, let's say you compare it to a traditional field watch, it's going to fit the bill, which for some will be a huge benefit. Well, for others, it might be a bit of a turnoff just because of kind of how plain and stark the watch is. But for me, I think within that field watch space, it definitely hits those marks, so I can appreciate those aspects. But again, guys, look at that. Although it is quite a bold watch, it just fits and rides on the wrist really beautifully. Check out the way the short links, they just lay very nicely on there. This watch isn't going anywhere. Nicely balanced by having that milled clasp to offset this nice chunky automatic timepiece. So very nice. Let's go ahead, get this off of the wrist, set it up for some low light transition, Lume shots, and closing thoughts. All right, guys, let's go ahead and hit the lights here. Oh, as you can see, this is quite a Lume beast, especially when you consider that this watch's mission isn't to be, out at the bottom of the ocean. Sure, it does have 200 meters of water resistance, so you could technically use this as something within water sports, but man, does that have outstanding lume when you think about it from the aspect of a field watch or an adventure watch. I love the contrast between the BGW9 with that blue tone and then the C3 with the green tone. Very nice, very bright, and very thickly applied. But one thing I like to do during these lume shots is work in some low light transition, because you're not always going to be out in the middle of a field enjoying direct sunlight. A lot of times you might find yourself, coming in and out of a building, walking underneath an overhang or the shade of a tree, maybe even just spending time in your favorite automobile. So it's nice to see how this watch will render in less than optimal lighting. And man, this is a looker. Look at the way that even that matte blast just holds and plays with the light a little bit differently than you would get from brushing and polishing. And then look at that dial. It goes from very deep, dark, matte black, almost a negative space, really making that dial pop in terms of legibility. And then even when it gets here, it's just has a certain way to where it navigates the light and it just absorbs it and doesn't really reflect it or take it on very much. And even if I get into some very high contrast, very unflattering lighting situation here, you can see that dial still stays quite legible, although that kind of satin effect on the texture of the dial does tend to capture light and kind of wash out the dial just a hair. I think in terms of legibility and contrast, still looks quite Fantastic. Look at that transitional there, guys. I think that is just great that if you had this particular piece and you're right there in the golden hour, whether you're out, you know, taking pictures of wildlife or, you know, some sceneries or anything like that, you do have a great looking timepiece right there in some of the, you know, softer light. So very, very nice from that perspective. And let's go ahead and hit the lights back here and get into some closing thoughts. Guys, on the wrist, this feels like a purpose-built sports watch. Almost Germanic in its clean and functional layout, as I mentioned. In terms of model variants, it's also available in a cream or a white dial option, which both are great. And then in terms of comparable models, guys, yeah, I think this competes with a lot of different types of watches. Everything from the Seiko Alpinist to something like the Archimede Outdoor. So you have, you know, very affordable Japanese on one side, and then some really great feature-rich German-made watches as well. And yeah, I mean, this is still competitive with even the latest everyday outdoor adventure flavor of the moment that you'll find micro brands putting out there pretty much on a monthly basis, because it's a very popular range right now. A lot of people are moving away from divers kind of as their everyday default sports watch pick and moving into field watches and kind of that everyday adventure bezel-less option. So very cool to see a classic like BOLDR kind of bring back something from their history. Although it's not the longest history, it's very cool that they have something already that is a bit timeless and that they can reissue in a way like this. For me, guys, the bottom line is this is a modern tool watch reissue that taps into what helped BOLDR become the staple they are today. It makes the likes of the Hamilton Khaki Field and Seiko Alpinist look like formal dress watches by comparison, and I think this is really more akin to something you might see from the catalog of Zinn or Damasco. And of course, in those cases, those watches are going to cost a lot more than $699. So even when you add in the bracelet at $139, this is still really a steal when you compare it in terms of the fact that it is packing, at the end of the day, a nice Swiss movement, as well as having a nice amount of water resistance and just an overall tough and versatile exterior. Yes, it'll be a little bit less versatile than something with a brushed case per se, but for those of you that dig this outdoor, very EDC-able style, this thing, I think, really speaks to a lot of folks. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you liked the video, please do hit like. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.